We're going to wait a few minutes to see if we have any other attendees who choose to log on. So I'll start talking about 333. Today as we dive into the subject of culturally responsive teaching and service learning. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about myself and tell you kind of where I'm coming from and what I believe about this topic. So my name is Danielle McGilvray, and I'm the school outreach coordinator for H2O for Life. H2O for Life is a nonprofit organization that provides a service learning opportunity for schools in the United States. Through H2O for Life, teachers and students raise awareness about the global water crisis while taking action to provide funds for a water project for a partner school in the developing world. My role at H2O for Life is to support teachers in the creation of meaningful standards-based curriculum that engages students, enhances their learning experience, and connects a direct and purposeful action piece. Prior to joining the H2O for Life team, I received my degree from Bethel University in elementary education. And with that, I had a middle-level endorsement in language arts and communications. And after graduating, I taught 6th grade English language arts at a middle school in Minnesota. While my background is in the classroom, I've always been passionate about my own personal service learning. I've traveled globally learning about and working among a variety of different cultures and communities. This experience translated into my classroom as I analyzed my own cultural lens and realized the importance of engaging my students in an education that was culturally relevant, personally valuable, and inclusive. While I tried to do that my best, it wasn't an easy task due to the abundance of other responsibilities that teachers have. In this juggling act, it is easy to fall into our natural tendencies to teach through a lens that only represents our own cultural views. This tendency proves the need for genuine learning on how to lead a culturally responsive classroom. I've spent a lot of time researching the colliding topics of culturally responsive teaching and service learning, and I just want to begin by thanking the experts in which I learned some things from. I took a lot of information from a journal called Fostering Culturally Responsive and Relevant Teaching and Global Awareness through the Integration of Service Learning. The novel, the book, Servicelearning in the Brain by Zaretta L. Hammond and Yvette Jackson. And then also a journal called High Expectations Mindset by Dan Heisler. While both subject matters, culturally responsive teaching and service learning, have been buzzwords in the education world over the past few years, they have not necessarily always been connected or shared in conjunction. In this webinar, we're going to take a peek at how true service learning has the potential to promote cultural competency within the classroom. And sometimes when I'm talking about cultural competency, I'll say CRT for culturally responsive teaching. The first step in establishing how service learning can promote a culturally responsive classroom is to develop a greater understanding of each subject matter on its own. After I've expanded on the topics by themselves, I will take time to establish them together, identifying where they work in conjunction. Finally, we will delve into two forms of service learning, dissecting the difference in order to distinguish service that perpetuates stereotypes versus service that develops cultural competency. And if you have any questions at all throughout the process, feel free to, type in the chat your question, and I'll hopefully get to those as soon as possible. So there are two realities of our world today, and that is A, that the 21st century is characterized by human interconnectedness and globalization, and B, there's a new complexity to cultural diversity within regions and local communities. And the question might be, how do these two realities influence the other? As our world develops and individuals become more and more connected to each other, people are expected to stay globally connected in a variety of ways, whether that be politically, socially, environmentally, among other things. As technology and communication platforms develop, this connectedness is continuously expanding. Globalization has allowed us to experience life in a way that might seem the same way as someone across the world. Our global community is fast developing and requires students to graduate from their educational experiences thinking creatively and with higher order thinking skills in order to keep up with that movement. This globalization introduces a pressure for educators to prepare all of their students for a global workforce, for an expanding world, and for the demand to think independently and innovatively. Yet the headlines that scream achievement gaps around the world, it makes us wonder, how do teachers do this for all of their students? What is the key? As we ask that question, we have to zone in on the classroom and wonder, how do teachers validate that A, each one of their students is a part of this globalization and that they are all interconnected, yet B, all students come from culturally unique backgrounds, which therefore cause them to interpret information through a different lens than their peers. For example, you may have two students in the classroom with two different cultural schemas. They see the exact same news report, i.e. the globalization and interconnectedness in our world, but they may have two very distinct reactions to that event. How does the teacher bridge that difference, hear those differences, validate and share those differences while balancing their own cultural lens? All individuals are entering the four walls of the classroom with a deep cultural perspective on the world that dramatically influences how that student interprets information and learns. How does the teacher combine these complex realities and make it so the classroom is as inclusive and challenging and engaging place for all children to learn, no matter their cultural perspective? How does a teacher tell each student that their cultural background is as an important piece to this grand puzzle we call the colliding global community? Or how does a teacher give each student equal opportunity to leave the classroom prepared to succeed in our ever-expanding global community? With these questions, we find the need to dive into the subject of culturally responsive teaching. What is culturally responsive teaching, and what is the importance of CRT? According to Zaretta L. Hammond, the author of Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, we have three pieces to the puzzle that continuously perpetuate the achievement gap among culturally diverse students. And it's quoted in that novel, in that book, that an educator that is teaching without the lens of CRT may clump their students into labeled groups due to their own perceptions of cultures, and consequently, they will first underestimate what disadvantaged students are intellectually capable of doing. And from that, as a result, they will postpone the more challenging and interesting work until they believe that that particular student has mastered the basics. And the end result of that is that they're then depriving that student of a meaningful or motivating contextual learning experience that is preventing them from being able to practice their higher order thinking skills. Educators who are using their own individual cultural lens to influence the way that they teach and perceive the students in their classroom will automatically fall into that trap. And this only perpetuates the achievement gap. This form of teaching limits the number of students who will leave the classroom prepared to immerse themselves in the globalization of our world. Culturally responsive teaching is a platform to minimize the achievement gap and prepare all students for our global community, no matter their cultural background. So that being said, I think you could say that if you were to look into a classroom of a teacher that is actively focusing on a culturally responsive teaching, you would kind of see a few specific things among all those teachers that are really focusing on that and what their community might look like and what their lessons might look like. The first thing is there's going to be an atmosphere of inclusion, and each student feels as if they belong and that they can contribute to the success of that community, no matter their cultural background. That students are fully aware that their personal culture adds to the culture of the classroom, and it's validated and important and is respected by all. It also will show kind of an environment of inclusiveness to show that that is the key to success of a culturally competent classroom. And so the other thing that we're going to kind of focus on also is it's important to establish those personal relationships with each and every student. The teacher has designated a specific time for students to share different cultural viewpoints, which is then validating that particular student and what their cultural background is. With that, by giving the students that opportunity to share, they're not only going to make the students feel safe sharing their opinions with the teacher, but as well as their classmates. This will create a strong social and emotional intelligence among all participants in the classroom, and each individual will feel as if they have a valued voice in the classroom. Thirdly, in a culturally responsive classroom, or what a culturally competent classroom might look like, is that every student, no matter their cultural background, is being challenged. And that means that a teacher is not perceiving his or her own cultural bias on a student, but they're actually looking at all their students equally and giving them the equal amount of challenge. That all students are going to be participating in stimulating learning activities that encourage them to use their higher level thinking skills. And fourth, but not finally, the teacher is cognitively making cultural scaffolds to engage with and teach students new concepts. This comes from a strong understanding of different levels of culture. So for example, a teacher isn't going to be able to, make that scaffold unless that particular student or that particular teacher has a greater understanding of all the cultural backgrounds within the classroom. And this comes with a level of knowing different levels of culture. So if we look, there are 3 levels of culture. And among those 3 levels, we have surface, shallow, and deep. Your surface culture is represented through items of culture that people can see. So your food, dress, music, etc. Those are going to be things that everyone can kind of see in the classroom. Your shallow culture is how one might interpret various behaviors. So how someone might pick up on your nonverbals, for example, rolling your eyes, not making eye contact, making eye contact. Deep culture is what controls their learning of new information and what guides your good versus bad schema. So what is right and wrong? And when a teacher has a strong understanding of these various layers of a culture within each individual student, they're going to be able to scaffold and support different learning situations. And they're also going to be able to create personal relevance and develop individual meaning as information is shared. Also keeping in mind the various classroom management and also managing those student relationships as a teacher is able to scaffold and kind of explain why one student may have reacted to a situation this way and another in a different way. It would be wonderful if a classroom just naturally developed in a way that is described above. It is essential that teachers actively practice specific pedagogical strategies for this to happen. For example, teachers need to spend time analyzing and reflecting on their own cultural competence. And this means looking at their own cultural lens, preventing them from equally valuing each student. Educators must become aware of their own thoughts around race and culture before they are able to promote a classroom that values diversity among students. And secondly, teachers should constantly be aware of the societal norms that all students are hearing before they enter the classroom. So for example, let's see here. So they must be constantly combating those norms. Kids are all going to be coming into the classroom with different perspectives, and they need to be critically conscious of that content that they're going to be entering the classroom with. And so this is not a one and done routine, but rather, a continuous teacher practice. They need to be constantly reflecting on kind of what those societal norms are as they teach. And last but not least, educators must establish equal and high expectations for all their students, no matter the background. By establishing high expectations for all students, they're going to be proving that they believe in all students. Again, that comes a lot with a teacher understanding kind of their own cultural schema. What do they believe about different students, and how do they equal that and make sure they hold every student up to the same expectation, to those high expectations? It's according to a study done by Hanover Research. And there's a quote that says, "Not only do students tend to increase or decrease their efforts to match the expectations laid out for them, but also that students are reasonably accurate in perceiving the extent to which their teachers favor some students over others by placing different expectations on them." And this issue is related but notably distinct from differentiated education, which should place the same high expectations on all students regardless of their varying starting points and subsequent end goals. So that being said, students are going to be able to pick up on a teacher's reaction if he or she is not holding them to these high expectations like they are every other student in the classroom. And so educators who are striving towards being culturally responsive teachers must never lower their expectations based upon their own cultural lens, as this will bolster the societal stereotypes that already exist. So this brings us kind of to the point where we're going to connect the two. Is there a connection between service learning and culturally responsive teaching? Is there, does service learning promote a culturally competent classroom? And so I'm going to kind of delve into that subject matter about how service learning truly does promote a culturally responsive classroom, and the importance of implementing a service learning project to do so. And so just to start off by defining what service learning is so that we're all kind of on the same page. Service learning is defined as a process of involving students in community service activities combined with facilitated means for applying the experience to their academic and personal development. It is a reciprocal and balanced emphasis on both students learning and addressing real needs in the classroom. The ultimate goal of implementing service learning in the classroom is to engage your students in those higher level thinking skills that we're seeing a high demand for in our workforce. It is to challenge them in community action and encourage learning beyond the classroom and beyond their own cultural schema that they're entering the classroom with. If any of those pieces, so the higher level thinking skills, the community action, the learning beyond the classroom, the real world connection, and the cultural schema is missing, then in fact it is not a true service learning experience. And so we're going to kind of dive into those different subjects about how those things can be implemented to promote service learning. So if we look at the higher level thinking skills, All students should be engaged by rigorous educational experiences, and all students should be challenged with high expectations for academic growth. To expect students to think beyond their cultural lens and to step foot into another culture, the teacher is naturally challenging them to use their higher level thinking skills. And so when a teacher is saying, take your own cultural lens and put your feet into someone else's and take a peek into a different culture, they're challenging their students at that point to use their higher level thinking skills. This portion of the service learning should be engaging and integrated with the standards. So it should naturally fit into your classroom standards and your goals of what you want to teach within your classroom. And the action and learning should naturally meet those academic goals. So it shouldn't be separate. They should be together. The higher level thinking skills when we're connecting our service learning with our classroom content. And then the community action gives students the opportunity to complete the action piece is empowering your youth. So you're holding every student in that classroom to a high expectation. You're requiring that they take action and that they are and will always be a contributing part of a global society. And you're not limiting that to one or another student, but you're actually saying to your entire classroom that each and every one of them is capable of making change and capable of being a change maker in our global community. And so you're holding them to a high expectation or to that same expectation. And then third is the learning beyond the classroom and extending that cultural schema. So you should be encouraging learning that transports your kids out of the classroom and creates a space for them to develop personal relevance and individual value. This piece should challenge your students to identify how they see themselves among this melting pot of cultures. So again, you're asking your students to step out of their comfort zone, to look at other cultures, to take the opportunity to develop their own personal relevance and kind of identify what their own cultural background looks like. And it looks like I'm going to skip ahead to a couple different slides. And we're going to talk about the correlation and how culturally responsive teaching and service learning are connected, and really look at how service learning can mold a culturally competent classroom. So as we kind of went over those key components of service learning, you may have heard some buzzwords that I use to talk about culturally responsive teaching in itself. And so we're going to go and kind of dive into the subject of the two of them together. And so when we look at the direct correlation between culturally responsive teaching and service learning, we see that service learning promotes inclusiveness. And so service learning in the classroom will naturally create a culture of empathy as the student body is seeking to relate to a community in which they are unfamiliar. Service learning challenges students to think beyond their own cultural lens and step foot into a different cultural norm. This teaches students to independently make those cross-cultural interactions and connections within their academic experience. The skills developed through this learning will carry into the classroom relationships. So by doing this already in your curriculum, you're going to be promoting a stronger student-to-student relationships. You're going to be creating this inclusiveness within your classroom. As we talked about, what does a culturally responsive classroom look like? It's inclusive and it's valuing each student's cultural background. And so by doing a service learning experience, you're naturally creating a culture of empathy as the student body is going to be seeking out this relation to a community in which they are unfamiliar with. The other component that service learning inspires and creates is it really does develop these personal relationships. So it doesn't just do your cross-cultural relations, but it also develops a sense of solidarity among the classroom. So while all students come from a different background, they're all working toward a common goal. So when you're doing your service learning, you're all learning about this and you're all taking the same action. And so your student community is coming around a common goal. And so while they all come from a different background, they're working towards the same thing. So students are going to form a small community within the classroom that supports the global community, consequently promoting classroom inclusiveness and cultivating a positive atmosphere. Service learning develops a classroom culture where students' individual voices are heard, accepted, and truthfully are encouraged. So every student feels as if, again, that they have a voice and that voice is appreciated within the classroom. Another thing that service learning will do that connects with culturally responsive teaching is it's going to have an impact of thought-provoking learning. Service learning creates a space for students to learn that all individuals and cultures have something to share and something to teach. And so this experience opens the door for raw and honest conversation about different cultures in which students come from, have never heard of, and or do not have a lot of information about in their own cultural background. It provides a safe space for students to authentically learn and process with the guide of a teacher who is culturally competent. Again, so kids get to have these really hard conversations, and they get to dive into these new cultures and learn these new things, but they have a teacher who's guiding them through that process, who already is culturally competent, who is working to avoid perpetuating social stereotypes and norms. And so implementing this service learning gives students that opportunity to learn in a way that is engaging and authentic, but also very safe. And fourth thing that how service learning kind of promotes culturally responsive teaching is creating individual value among the students. So a really important component of service learning is the expectation that students will reflect on what they have learned as an individual. And this time is incredibly important for students as they are given the opportunity for self-discovery. They're given the opportunity to see themselves within the realm of a global community, a classroom community, as well as an individual, and how do they fit within that global community. And so those are kind of some of our direct connections between service learning and culturally responsive teaching. And we have, but that's kind of not where the connections end. There's so many connections that it was hard to pick which ones to focus on, but I'll just touch on a few other ones and how service learning kind of promotes that culturally responsive teaching and what effects that it does have. So service learning empowers our youth, no matter the individual's cultural background, no matter their age, ethnicity, or socioeconomic background, that individual is given the opportunity to make change. And I think that this piece is really important. If you take youth who are often bunched into the category of underserved through various cultural lenses, these are the students that are looked at through a particular cultural lens, and then they are never asked to serve others because they are the ones who, in quotations, need serving. And so through service learning in the classroom, not one culture is being eliminated or discouraged from serving, but rather it is this class community as a whole that comes together and takes a thought-provoking issue and makes change. So service learning is really service learning in the classroom is really truly empowering individuals who are the most often separated from that opportunity to serve. Another thing that service learning projects promote is student-led learning. So we're always looking for these opportunities to let students kind of guide their own learning and to grow among kind of what they want to be learning. And so students are encouraged to take the lead on the service, and they're challenged to make individual real-world connections while they're promoting their own school connectedness. So they are being challenged to kind of learn about themselves through this process, but also to kind of guide their own learning experience as they take on a service learning project. Service learning also is going to break down cultural boundaries and encourage students to have cultural conversations in a safe space. So again, we talked earlier about how teachers are able to be those mentors and those guides through these conversations that sometimes promote stereotypes and sometimes promote those negative societal norms. But by doing service learning in the classroom, you have that space where those cultural boundaries are able to be broken down in a safe space to have those cultural conversations among your student body. And then the last thing is service learning helps to develop a student's own cultural identity. So through this experience, they're going to see stereotypes proven wrong, and they're also going to develop their own understanding of who they are and what their cultural growth or their cultural identity is, and what that means to their own learning experience and how that influences their own learning experience. And so when we look at this, we are going to kind of dive into two different types of service learning. And The reason we're going to do this is because I think that one type of service learning that when it's implemented will perpetuate those stereotypes, while another, it will not do that. And so when connecting service learning to the classroom to promote CRT or culturally responsive teaching, it is essential that we clarify that the service learning is being implemented in a culturally competent way. And so as educators, we have to be constantly making conscious decisions to be culturally competent. We need to be, as service learning implementers, we must always be cognizant of the type of service learning that we are promoting, encouraging within the classroom. And the reason I say that is because I believe there are two very common service learning styles. And the first is seen through a philanthropic lens, and the second one is seen through a civic lens. And so while neither form of service is necessarily wrong, we do want to look at the one that does promote cultural responsive teaching within the classroom rather than one that does not promote culturally responsive teaching. And so I'm going to kind of start with the philanthropic service learning. Individuals that promote philanthropic service learning don't fully immerse themselves in the learning experience, but rather they see themselves coming into this community as, some might say, the saviors. They have this mentality that they're coming in to rescue this group that's in need. And with that kind of service learning, there's not true academic learning that's taking place. The students are not being required to reflect on their own growth that they've experienced, and they're not being asked to look at stereotypical cultural norms that are being portrayed in this situation. This way of implementing service promotes stereotypes and actually is going to create a wider gap among cultures within your own classroom. And so that's why I encourage that we look really closely more at the civic side of service learning. For a teacher to successfully implement service learning in a fashion that will promote culturally responsive teaching, they must participate in that purposeful civic learning. The learning must enhance the academic goal of the classroom. So we talked about how it's important that it meets those classroom needs and that it meets those classroom standards. But extended from that, the service should be meaningful and also relevant to the activity that you're doing. So students should see that they're also gaining from this experience. They shouldn't be going in and saying that we are just giving, but actually it's a give and a take. They're giving, but they're also taking, and they're having an experience that is a learning experience. And they are becoming culturally competent. They are acquiring academic knowledge, but they are also being challenged to think at a higher level. And they're developing their own cultural identity through this process. And they are just as greatly served as those that they are serving. So if educators are to implement purposeful civic service learning within their classroom, they are going to be encouraging cultural competency among their students. So, and that kind of brings me to my last point. And we're going to talk about how I just really believe that if you spend time nurturing that sense of empathy and responsibility for the larger community, in return, you are going to develop a generation of global citizens out of all of your students, not just some of your students. And so that's really, really important that you take that opportunity to use service learning as a way to promote a culturally responsive classroom. And I apologize, some of these slides are a little out of order, but I just want to check and see if you have any questions for me about culturally responsive teaching and service learning. And with that, I do want to invite you, if you have more questions, if you want to continue this conversation, to please reach out. I would love to have a conversation with you about what culturally responsive teaching can look like in your classroom, as well as how you might be able to implement a service learning experience to impact your students. You can do that by calling the H2O for Life office. It is 651-756-7577. And again, I would love to just chat about the different opportunities that you feel like would be good for your classroom setting. And I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me dive into this service learning, culturally responsive teaching topic. And I look forward to sharing more.